What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. Today I want to talk to you guys about age gap relationships, hierarchical relationships, and I will go over the research. I will also share with you at the end some of my original research on this as well. So, first, some definitions of mine. What are these things? What's an age gap relationship? You probably already know, but I have decided the working definition here. A romantic or a sexual relationship where one partner is substantially older than another. Hierarchical relationship, perhaps that term is a little bit less familiar, in which case we're talking about a relationship where one partner is in a superior position, right? Okay, so typically we would think of that in the context of like employment, right? A boss with a subordinate or an employee, or a student with a teacher in the university. All throughout this, I'm going to be talking about adult relationships. So I say student, teacher. I'm not talking about like people in high school or whatever. I'm talking about adults in this case. So this is what we're going to be looking at going forward. Now, one of the reasons why this is an interesting topic is, of course, because there's kind of a taboo around it, right? It's a mild taboo, but it's a taboo nonetheless. Some people really dislike age gap relationships. Across the research, as well as in my own recent research, about 30% tends to view these relationships pretty negatively. You have about 30-40% that are pretty neutral on them, and then people that view them more positively. So not most people, but nonetheless a substantial minority of people who view these age gap relationships pretty negatively. So why? Why might that be? Well, one reason people often give is a belief that they're exploitative, right? This is related to kind of like the so-called power dynamics discourse, that the relationships are exploitative where the older partner, usually a man, it's almost always a man that's older, has some sort of power or manipulation going on with the younger partner. And that also leads into questions and discourse of consent. There's a question, when a power dynamic exists, can people consent at all? And of course, there's really a whole spectrum of discourse as far as that is concerned. From people who would say, okay, you're in a relationship with your boss. They're telling you, if you break up, you're going to get fired. So is there really consent? And then at the very far end of that spectrum, you've even had some feminist authors who have said, there's a power imbalance in all heterosexual relationships. Therefore, heterosexual relationships are fundamentally unequal and you cannot consent at all. So there's a spectrum of this power imbalance consent discourse, perhaps some positions within that more understandable than others. So that's one objection. I'm not telling you that this is the case. I'm just saying this is what people say. A second objection is that these relationships are unfair, and not necessarily unfair for the person in the relationship, but unfair for people around them. And why might that be? So again, say you're in a relationship with your boss. Maybe you get special favors at work. Maybe they fire someone else instead of firing you, right? Maybe you're in a relationship with the professor, and so they give you better grades. Or they're, it's usually not someone that's an undergraduate actually getting graded by the professor in these cases, but maybe they, are helping you more with your research or something like that. Whatever the case may be, is that fair to third parties? So that's another concern that people bring up. Another one that comes up occasionally is the so-called brain age of adults, and you will hear things, this is particularly when discussing age gap relationships with a young woman between like 18 and 25. People will occasionally say, the brain is not fully developed, can they really consent, and that sort of a thing. So I'm not going to go into that a lot in this video, but I will say that's probably not very faithful to kind of what the neuroscience shows on brain development. It's not that the brain is not fully developed, but for some people it doesn't, fully develop until their 30s. There's a lot of individual variation. If that really contributes to behavior or the ability to consent in a meaningful way, pretty dubious, but whatever. This is something that people believe about age gap relationships. There's some other reasons I'll go into as we go through the video, but the important thing is, why? Taboo. We realize that. And we have to ask, knowing that, is this the real reason for a taboo? Because certainly it's a principle of psychology, of psychoanalysis, of human behavior and cognition, that many of our emotions, our beliefs, our attitudes, they're not actually derived from our thoughts first, so to speak. They precede those. So, and that's particularly evident when it comes to taboos. Many taboos that we have, especially very strong ones, are things that may have evolved very, very early in human history before we knew why, right? Before we could come up with a good explanation. For example, no one knew about like prefrontal cortex development until, a few decades ago. So certainly, but this age gap taboo is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's very old. And people say, people used to get married very, very young. We'll get into that also. But the taboo is certainly older. So this is kind of an explanation that people come up with after the fact. So what might be a real reason? Well, we talk about judgment, decision making. We talk about forming beliefs, making a rational argument. But this is kind of a part of our folk psychology, so to speak. Emotion is always present in our beliefs, the decisions that we make. Rarely is it a totally dispassionate or rational belief system that we form without that. And so what can contribute to that? It's my opinion, again, I'll get into this a little bit later, that this taboo kind of forms first and then the reasons come later. People have a strong and a visceral kind of ick, right? They see these relationships and it makes it, and they think gross. And is that feeling a reason? Well, it's not a reason, but that's, I think, what drives it to some extent. But as I said a couple of times already, we will get into that a little bit. First, I want to go over some of the research that we have on age gap and hierarchical relationships. How common are these things? What are they associated with? In the second part of the video, I will go over some of my own recent research on this, looking at some personality traits related to age gap and hierarchical relationships, right? Dark triad, social dominance orientation, politics, a bunch of things that I don't think anyone has ever tested or looked at before. So to get an idea of age gap relationships, how common are they? We could look at the US Census as a starting point here, which gives us average age gaps in marriage, okay? Here's a chart. I took it from Wikipedia, but it's based on representative US statistics data. The average age for an age gap in a marriage is about 2 to 3 years. That's going to be with the man being older. But at the same time, about 6.7% of the US population who is married has an age gap of 10 years or more. So a minority, but a fairly substantial minority that actually have pretty large age gaps, and you get into a 5-year age gap, it's going to increase as well. Marriage is one thing to look at. We can also look at relationships, right? Because many people are having age gap relationships, but they're not getting married, right? Most relationships don't end up in marriage. Most relationships end. So an Ipsos poll, again, representative data of the United States, found that 39% of Americans have been in an age gap relationship with someone who is 10 years or older. So that's a very large minority of Americans that have been in an age gap, right? That's quite a lot. At least at some point, a lot of people have dated someone with a large age gap. And for women within that, it's 29% of women, okay? So, by sex, it is, again, something that is pretty common for women as well to be in a large age gap. We're looking at hierarchical relationships as well. So what do we know about that? The Society for Human Resource Management also conducted a nationally representative poll of Americans. They found that about 13% of Americans have dated a boss. So that can give us a pretty good idea probably about how common a hierarchical relationship in workplaces are. And so we also want to ask about students. Of course, there's much less research on student-teacher-adult relationships, right? That's not as easily accessible as to get a representative sample from as for example, people who are employed. So, and it hasn't been researched as much. What can be said about that? We have a study by Pop and colleagues here, but this is from 1979. And they found that 25% of the students in their sample, female students, reported having sex with a university faculty member. So that's actually really big. That's a lot, it seems like a very, very large estimate. A little bit later, a little under 10 years later, Glasser and Thorpe, they found that 17% of students reported having a romantic relationship with the professor. So also, perhaps, pretty high. Is that something that is going to continue today? These are kind of older studies. They're not representative samples, they're convenient samples. So is that really how common they're going to be in the whole population of students? We don't know, but it goes to show, you can take a sample of students and you might find that even this sort of thing is pretty common. A more recent study by Potschmidt, 2021, they found that 27% of students knew someone involved romantically with the professor. That's a lot. Now, important because this doesn't mean that 27% of students were in a romantic relationship with the professor. This is how many students reported knowing someone. So you take a sample of a class, say there's 100 people in the class, and say 5 people are having a relationship with the professor. You might still, have a bunch of students in there that know those 5 people. So it's probably going to be a high estimate just based on a guess, from the methodology that they used. But still, it's pretty high if 1 out of 4 students, can say, I know someone who has a romantic relationship with the professor. So is this surprising? Because I think when we think of student and teacher relationships, often, what comes to mind, what is salient, right? What appears in the news is you hear like a student arrested, or a teacher arrested for having sex with their student or something like that. And in these cases, it's children. But in universities, most universities actually don't have rules against this. Most universities that do have rules against this only have rules that limit the relationship if it's someone in a direct supervisory position. So a professor and an undergraduate student, right? You can't date someone you're teaching a class to. Or an advisor and a graduate student. And even that, that's not always limited, or even limited most of the time, because most universities actually have no rules against this. This depends on country, I should say, because Australia, if I remember correctly, actually has a pretty clear blanket ban. The United Kingdom has a pretty clear blanket policy. So I'm talking about the United States when I say most don't actually prohibit these. But in any case, what we do see is that there are rules put in place, like you can't have a relationship with someone you are directly supervising, that you have direct power over. So what happens when people eventually get into a relationship? Because they do, right? Assortative mating, you have people that are very similar for one, and then you have the proximity effect, where you have people that are, mostly they're interacting with their students, mostly they're interacting with these other people in that environment. It's inevitable that these relationships are going to form. So what happens when they do? Usually, the university that have a policy, they'll say, okay, you need to kind of recuse yourself or whatever. You need to take yourself to another area, switch them to another advisor, or wait for them to finish the class, or whatever the case may be. And so that's kind of how these things continue. In Bennett, we find another study on these student and faculty relationships. And here they're asking university professors, faculty at the university, do you approve? Do you not approve? And here we see, it's pretty split, if I remember correctly in this study, that the approval and the disapproval. But they also asked about why. Why do you not approve? And only 12% of this population cited the power imbalance, right? They asked if these were forms of sexual harassment. It was something like 85% said it's not sexual harassment, it's a consensual relationship. So support for these relationships as well, perhaps higher than a lot of people, I think, realize. This was something I mentioned at the beginning of the video, was this belief in kind of a power dynamic. I think that's a belief that certain people hold regarding these relationships, but at least in this more recent study, it wasn't the main explanation that people cited for this disapproval of these relationships, so to speak. Another recent study here by Castonguay in 2018. They found that only 20% of students actually supported a ban on these student-teacher relationships. So, as I mentioned, most universities, at least in the United States, don't ban these flat out. Turns out most students probably don't actually support a full ban of these relationships either. Eli and Bowen, they asked about policies in general, some sort of regulation, right? So, do you want a ban? Do you want a policy like some universities have where you can't date a student? And about 42% supported some form of regulation. Still, a majority said don't regulate it. Just let people do whatever they want to do. You might think, men would like that, women wouldn't. There was no sex difference in support in this case. And Potschmidt, mentioned previously, found similar result. About 50% supported some kind of regulation, not a flat-out ban. And 50%, just let the adults be adults and form relationships, whatever. Here is the same study I mentioned from Glasser and Thorpe. One of the main findings here related to this. They found that, why, when is the relationship unethical, so to speak. So they said that it was unethical mostly, this was, the main response, when the person was in a direct supervisory role. So kind of reflecting these policies, right? You know, it shouldn't be a professor and their immediate student. It shouldn't be an advisor and their grad student, so to speak. But it could be, you know, someone maybe that had someone in a class or whatever. Well, this is what, you know, so far we're just looking at opinions that people have about these relationships. What else did they say in this study? Well, most of the students in this study who actually had these relationships, and this is one of the few studies that actually looked at the individuals who reported themselves having one of these relationships. Most of the students who were in these relationships reported that they weren't inappropriate or that they weren't coercive, which maybe is what you would expect. And this is something we will see kind of throughout this and in my own research as well, is that people on the outside looking in, the third parties, when they see age gap relationships, when they see hierarchical relationships, they tend to view them more negatively than the people who actually participate in them. Why might that be? Well, there's a selection effect at play, right? People who are really averse to these relationships to begin with, they're not going to get into these relationships. If they're not in these relationships, they might see other people in them and think, you know, maybe they're getting some kind of favoritism or whatever. And also, you know, they might have an image of these relationships that is not accurate, or not based in personal experience, that is different from the ones that are having the relationships. And the people having the relationships are saying, you know, this is a pretty normal relationship. And to the people on the outside, it looks really weird. So difference in opinion between people who are actually in these relationships and people who are looking at these relationships from the outside. And that's something we will see, as I mentioned, in the second part of this video, looking at my research as well. So Skeen and Nelson, they also looked at students who had been in a relationship with their professor. And they specifically looked at this exchange for benefits model. Okay, what is that? You know, it's the favoritism thing, right? It's the belief that there is something unfair going on, that there are benefits. So most students here didn't report any sort of exchange for benefits. More students said that they initiated it than professors, because they also interviewed professors who were in these relationships in this case. And 60% indicated that, you know, the initiation was mutual. Not in the slide, but in this study, what was interesting was, you know, they did a mixed methods analysis. So they looked at the data, but they also interviewed all of the people, asked them about their experiences. And one of the things that came out was, you know, being in a relationship with a professor actually made it harder for me. Not only did I not get any benefits, but it was more difficult. Why? Why might that be? Well, one, you know, there's always, even if there's not a ban or a regulation on these relationships at the time, there's always that kind of idea of favoritism and impropriety. So they reported, you know, we kind of had to sneak around. They didn't want to help me too much. These were usually junior professors and graduate students. So it wasn't like a really old professor and like someone who was 18, you know, both people in, you know, like late 20s, mid 30s. So, but they would say, you know, my advisor, my professor, whatever, didn't want to help me as much because, you know, he didn't want to look like he was showing me special attention. He didn't want to look. So they kind of overcorrect. And maybe through that overcorrection, they actually kind of withhold. So what was interesting in this paper was that most of the people said, you know, it didn't make my academic career easier dating a professor. It actually made it a little bit harder. But nonetheless, you know, most of the participants in this viewed the relationship positively. In retrospect, they didn't view it as like coercion or something exploitative. So, you know, perhaps different from what people think about these relationships kind of from the outside. A little bit more recent study, but still, you know, 20 years. Bella and Gossett, they also found something similar. You know, they titled this paper, we're going to test the lecherous professor hypothesis. What is that? You know, the idea that you have like a really old professor who is like preying on the youngest students, okay? So what did they find here? So most relationships, about 60 to 70%, were actually initiated by the student. You ask, you know, the students who initiated it, they said me. So in most cases, it's not the lecherous professor, so to speak, initiating these relationships. Also contrary, I guess, to that lecherous professor stereotype, the age gaps in a lot of these relationships were kind of small. as I mentioned, you might have like a graduate student and a junior professor. It's not like the 60-year-old dude with tenure and like an 18-year-old undergraduate that is usually forming these relationships. They're not going to be in contact very much. You think, how do these relationships form? Well, you have people working together in a lab. You have people spending time to each other. They're talking outside of school because they're trying to organize things or whatever. And so that's kind of how these relationships form. And so you get people kind of that are going to be closer in age in that sense, not necessarily the youngest women in most of these. Looking more broadly now at age gaps. What sort of things do age gaps predict? Again, this is a field, or a topic or whatever, that there isn't a whole lot of research on. So we can ask questions like relationship satisfaction, is it bad for physical health when you have a big age gap, like a man who is much older, right? Because, as age increases, fertility decreases. Older age at conception is associated with birth, I want to say birth defects, but, on average, worse birth outcomes and that sort of a thing. So looking at age gap relationship research, what kind of questions are answered there? So in Minochet and Russ in 2022, they found that large age gaps didn't predict lower fertility, didn't predict lower well-being in relationship or life well-being in general, measured by their mental health measures. And it didn't predict divorce either. So these are things I think that people believe about age gap relationships that maybe aren't quite so clear in the research. This was in a sample in Colombia. And this paper was a more recent replication of a study by Lawson and colleagues a couple of years ago in 2021. They looked at a sample in Tanzania, so you have this cross-cultural replication, and they found the same things. There was no association with low fertility, no association with divorce, no association with poor mental health. So basically, in these papers at least, the age gaps did as well or a little bit better than relationships with a smaller age discrepancy. What about people in the age gap relationships themselves? Are they weird? Is there something wrong with them? As I said, not a lot of research has been done. What do we know? Skintleberry and Fowler in 2016 looked at attachment styles. And if you know what attachment styles are, you have people who are securely attached, they're secure with their partner, they're confident, and you have people that are insecurely attached, you have anxiously attached. I've mentioned in the past, I think people think that these are kind of like hokey or they're not real, but there's, attachment styles are something that has a lot of really well replicated psychology around it. In any case, larger age gap relationships, are they associated with one of the negative attachment styles, so to speak, anxious or avoidant? They weren't. They actually predicted secure attachment styles. So people more likely to have a secure attachment style were more likely to enter these age gap relationships as well. Groot and Van den Brink in 2002, they looked at age gaps in a Dutch population in Holland, and what do they find? Large age gaps, again, kind of like the previous two studies in the last slide that we talked about, were associated with higher satisfaction, higher marital satisfaction, and life satisfaction. So we don't really see signs that these relationships are worse, despite the age gap. So these are certainly things, when people talk about the age gap taboo, they bring up things like divorce and fertility, are these bad relationships? Are these exploitative? And you might expect certain things to be associated with them if they were. You might expect one of the worst attachment styles. You might expect lower relationship satisfaction. Certainly. Is that really the case? At least this research indicates that it might not be. Here is a recent study by Pelham, and what he found was that larger age gaps were associated with higher selective fitness. So what does that mean? Well, there was lower mortality at birth. The larger the age gap, the more likely a child was to survive following birth. Additionally, the more likely a child was to receive natural breastfeeding following birth. And this was also associated with a slow life strategy. So slow life, fast life strategy describes kind of a pattern of behavior. Are people taking less risks? Are they building up kind of a strong foundation? Are they doing less crime? These are all things associated with a slow life strategy. Are they being less promiscuous? Those sorts of things, and this is kind of controversial to apply fast and slow life strategies to individuals. Some psychologists are very critical of this. Others have done it. So talking about slow life, fast life histories for individuals as far as personality goes in psychology. Some people will, they'll say, no, that's BS. But whatever, that's what it was associated with in this study anyway. So you don't actually see, I think that's another thing that people might actually associate with age gaps is kind of the idea that it's like an old player, right, who's like preying on young women. But if it's associated with a slow life history strategy, then it might actually be the opposite. This might be someone who's more family oriented in that case. And of course, this chart, I think many of you may have seen this already, the famous OkCupid data that asked about who looks best to men and women at what age. Women reported, very consistently, men close to their own age. Men, on the other hand, who looked the best to them? Women at the end, you see them all, boom, at 20, 21, 24, that sort of a thing. So, and I think in this, I don't remember exactly, but I think the bottom limit was 20. So, men, if you asked them younger, maybe they would have even said younger, but whatever. What you see is that female attractiveness to men, at least in this, and there's reasons to think that this is not entirely accurate. It doesn't reflect actual age gaps in choice, for example. It is kind of that stated versus revealed preferences thing, but pretty clear discrepancy in how men and women view these age gaps, which also is something we'll see in the second part with my research. Men and women do view these differently. They report different desire for wanting age gaps and that sort of a thing. So some other reasons that I have seen for this taboo in the general discourse out there, because certainly, watching what people say and observing opinions about this, association with pedophilia, if someone says, someone says it's okay for Leonardo DiCaprio or whoever that is to date this 19-year-old model on Twitter, you will just see 1,000 comments like pedophile, pedophile. Okay, well, I mean, it's an adult for one, but I'm not going to say it's wrong or right. I'm not here to defend or take a position on this. I am here to say this is one thing that emerges as common that people seem to associate with age gap relationships, and particularly when the woman is young. Probably no one would say that about like a 30 and a 40-year-old man, but that's one. There's the brain age belief, right? Like, oh, the brain is not fully developed yet. Probably not a very good explanation, but that's, again, something people believe. Lower fertility in older men. Does that lead to problems? Maybe it does. It didn't in the study that we just looked at, but on average, age is associated with fertility problems. It's associated with some birth problems as well. The power dynamics that we went over, and an interesting one that I will use to seek into the next part of this video is the relatively high age of marriage in Western versus non-Western populations. So this is something that I kind of found interesting that I think a lot of people have a misconception about as well. Let's go into the next part and look at that. We're going to talk about the European marriage pattern, okay? The EMP. A lot of people believe that we used to get married at a really, really young age. And not only that we used to get married at a very young age, but that it used to be really common for like really old men to marry like teenagers, right? Like, oh, it was totally normal for like a 35-year-old man to marry like a 14-year-old. That was never really the case, at least not in Western history, and that's why when I say Western versus non-Western in the last slide, that's kind of what I'm talking about. You can see this, even now in some parts of the world where this happens, Afghanistan. But in the West, at least for, the past few, I say at least the past 1,000 years or something, this was not a common arrangement. Going over some data here and some studies on this, and there hasn't been a lot either, but I think this is pretty comprehensive. So between about 1200 and 1500 in Finland, the average age of marriage for women, about 25 years old. This had a standard deviation of about 2 to 3 years, which is consistent across pretty much all of these studies. I didn't list it in the slides, but thought I should mention it now. So most of the people are getting married pretty close to that. So if you think, oh, the average age is 25, but some of them were getting married at 10 or whatever, probably not very many, Average ages for marriage, about 800 years ago or so, pretty similar to what they are now, or at least what they were, in the 1950s, I should say. Or, well, that's not even correct, because in the 1950s, average age for marriage was about 19 or 20. So it was even lower in the 1950s than it was, 800 years ago. We're kind of returning to that. So France, 1300 to 1700. Average age for marriage was about the early 20s. And as I mentioned, the average age gaps, very, very small. And having unmarried women in their 20s was also very common, about 10 to 20% of all women in that demographic. So it wasn't the case that women universally married young, or that they married really old men when they were young, or that young people got married really early, or that really old men married really young women. All of these different kind of hierarchical or age gap scenarios that people say, like return to the tradition, it used to be that way. Not really. Another paper in late medieval and early modern period in Holland, okay, early 20s. Medieval England, also about 25. Italy, 21 for women, 25 for men. And, the classic research of Hagenel, the Hagenel line, right, that talks about, this was the European marriage pattern here, and here we have, other areas of the world, right? These other areas of the world where marriage is occurring much younger, and there's a larger age gap. Well, here you have, in Europe, the European marriage pattern across all of Europe, average age about 25 years old. So this is perhaps related to the age gap taboo, because something we'll see is that the age gap taboo is not really just a taboo about age gaps. It's a taboo about having a relationship with a woman who's too young. And too young is about between, that 18 and 24 age range. You can see large age gaps between someone who's like 70 and 50. People don't care. They won't blink an eye. And that's kind of what the research I conducted shows. You ask about, a 10-year age gap between someone who's 20 and 30, and that's when you get a lot of disapproval, right? Why? Because the woman is young. It's not the magnitude of the gap. And so there's a European tradition that goes back, at least 1,000 years, that viewed, that said, don't get married that young, basically. There are some exceptions. Age gaps were larger, and women were married young if they were of the higher classes. Okay, so I think that's where people get the idea that these really large age gaps were very common, and that and that old men marrying young women like teenagers was very common, because you hear that about famous people, right? The famous great men of history, so to speak, right? Kings and that, like this king married a 13-year-old or whatever. So, arranged marriages and that sort of thing were more common for the upper classes, for royalty, for aristocracy. If you go back further, if you look at the Roman era and that sort of a thing, then it's less clear when people got married. I think it's the case that people got married earlier. So if the average was 25 around, the late modern period, for example, you go back to the Roman Empire, you get an average that's about 18 for men and women. I don't know if it's clear if there were large age gaps or not. I've dug through a lot of historical sources on this. I haven't found much super convincing either way that would indicate there were large age gaps, but certainly younger marriages did occur. I think probably they were more matched in age, because when you look at the inscriptions, which is how a lot of these age gaps are assessed, of ages and couples who are buried together, then that's what you see, is like young men and young women who are buried together who are both like 18. So, you get young couples that have somehow died. Anyway, that is kind of the point of this section, okay, is that this taboo, it goes back, it's not something new. It goes back a little bit, and you can see that in literature as well. You can see that in classical literature, European literature, that people always kind of viewed an old guy dating a young woman as being kind of gross. There are, accounts, historical and fictional, where it's like a nightmare for a woman. She has to, she has a lover who's her age in her village or whatever the case may be, and they want to get married, but then, but she has to marry, her uncle's brother who's like 20 years older, and so she runs away. This is almost like an archetype. It's a classical motif for a story that is saying like, ooh, young women having to marry old guys is not what they want to do, whatever. So it's not something new. The age gap taboo is what I'm saying. We can go in now to the final section, and this is my research. I have it up on the website, datepsychology.com. Check it out because that's where all the statistical tests, all of the math and everything is, the charts and all of that, much more detail. But I want to share it with you here because, as I mentioned, I don't think anyone has tested these hypotheses. No one has looked at the relationship between some of these things. What are those? Well, let's look and see. What did I test? Okay, we're looking at the dark triad. How is the dark triad related to age gaps? Support for age gaps, desire for an age gap. Having had a large age gap, right? What is the dark triad? Psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism. We're looking at social dominance orientation, right? That is kind of the belief that your in-group should have dominance over other out-groups in society, but also individually, that the world is a rough place. You have to dominate it, take advantage of people, dominate others in a sense. Belief in a hostile world is another measure I used. Belief in a hostile world scale. And what is that? People who view the world as a very threatening place, like the world is getting worse. There's, people trying to step on us all the time. Crime is getting worse. People that have this, belief that the world is hostile and negative, does that predict age gaps or something like that? I guess, maybe the first two, given that people think age gaps are exploitative, it makes sense why I asked those. Maybe belief in a hostile world doesn't make as much sense intuitively, so I'll explain why I included that measure. It's possible that people who view age gaps negatively, right, see the world as a hostile place. So they see exploitation or danger when there is none, right? They have a pessimistic view of the world. So that's why I included that scale. Is that the case? Well, we will see going forward. I looked at the actual largest age gaps that participants had. So when I look at actual age gaps going forward, that's what we're talking about. I asked, what is the magnitude of the largest age gap you have had? I assessed support for age gaps, and the way that I did that, as well as for hierarchical relationships, was I created a series of vignettes that said, 20-year-old woman dating a 30-year-old man. These are all scenarios where the man is older. So throughout this, we should keep that in mind. All of these age gaps, when I talk about age gaps, the man is always older. That's what we're talking about. Hierarchical relationships, I set it up like, a manager is dating his employee. A famous movie star is dating a model. The president of the country is dating, his wife. And then there was another that was, a junior professor is dating a graduate student. So these scenarios that kind of resemble, real world common hierarchical relationships. I asked about who had sex with a boss or professor or had a romantic relationship. Sex or a romantic relationship. So we can also look at people who engaged in hierarchical relationships, just like we look at people who have engaged in large age gap relationships, and then also a measure of politics, just a left to right, 1 through 7 Likert scale. Here are some descriptive statistics from this, just to give you an idea. Total sample size, 346. So the mean age for men and women, about 30 years old, most of them heterosexual. Okay. Politics, pretty even split for men and women. So we don't have a left-wing bias in participants. We don't have a right-wing bias. Pretty consistent, even split down the middle. Here are some descriptive statistics for age gap preferences. Who wants what? That sort of a thing. Let's look and see what those show. So women, half of all women, they say they want an older man, right? And 63% of men say they want a younger woman. So, very consistent with past research. Women show a preference for older men. Men show a preference for younger women. This doesn't ask how much older or how much younger, which we will get into. But there we see that. Okay, so as expected, right? The standard preferences that we see very, very consistently across the research. Women want someone who's a little older. Men want someone who is a little younger. So 7% of men in this sample said that they had sex with a boss, with an employer. 14% of women said that they did. So that's actually pretty close, at least for women, to the nationally representative statistics, right? We saw in the beginning it was about 13% of Americans reported having had a relationship with a boss. Sex with a teacher. 4% of men in my sample said that they had sex or a relationship with a teacher. About 1% of the women did. So this is much lower than the research we covered at the beginning that also used, this is a convenient sample. The research at the beginning, also a convenient sample. So, there's no reason to expect that they're going to be the same. Ultimately, different populations, but much lower than the earlier estimates that we covered at the beginning, right? That said like 25% of students had sex with a teacher or whatever. It seems high at face value, whatever. We see a different result here in these numbers. This is an interesting one, and we'll look at a graphical representation of this, but the average desired age gap for men was 5.5 years younger. For women, it was 2.5 years older. So men want a woman who is younger than women want a man who is older. The average larger age gap. For men, it was about the same as the desired age gap. Most men had a relationship where the largest age gap they ever had was 5.5 years. For women, it was larger. The largest age gap on average that women had was 8.5 years. So a lot of women, even if they indicate a preference for a short age gap or a small age gap, are actually having much larger age gaps. Men approved of age gaps more, and also men approved of hierarchical relationships more. Some of these we'll look at in charts. Here's a chart for the average largest age gap ever compared with the ideal age gap. What do people report they want, and what do they actually do, right? So we're looking at kind of the stated versus revealed preferences. Okay, men, it was the same, 5.5. On average, men are dating that, and that's what they say they want. Note that this is also different from those OkCupid stats, right? Which ask like, when is a woman most attractive? Which is also a different question. So you shouldn't expect this necessarily to be precisely the same. It's a different question. But for women, what do we see here? Okay, women say, my ideal age gap is just 2 years. I want a man who's close to me in age. But a lot of these women, and it was about 33% of the female sample, dated someone who was 10 years older or more. The average age gap was 8.4. So even if, the stated preference is 2, there's a lot of women who are dating someone older. What does that mean? We talk about revealed versus stated preferences. There's a problem with just interpreting anything that anyone does as like a truly revealed preference, right? Because it could be, I really would like someone who is my age, but I met someone who I like in every other way, so I'm going to put the age thing aside. And then, you could also interpret like women say they want someone close to their age, but they really want old men. Looking at the data, you could take it either way, but you can't draw a strong conclusion that, women want older men from this kind of data. But it does show, a difference that, at least some of the time, women are willing to date men who are perhaps much older than what like their ideal preference on paper would be. Here is another chart. So this is something we're going to see throughout this very consistently. Men show higher approval for age gaps, right? Higher support for age gaps and for hierarchical relationships as well. These plots here, when I was making these charts and posting them up, I had some people that said they had a hard time understanding them. So this is called a violin plot. It is basically just a box plot with a distribution underlay. You guys think about like a distribution, right? When you see it horizontally and it's a curve. And so where it's fat, right, that's where most of the responses are. This is the same way. This is where most of the responses are. So if you look at the second violin plot here, right, from the left, you will see that the big fat belly of it is around 20, a support score of 20. And so that means that's where most of the responses were. Important to understand this going forward, looking at some of these other charts, because that tells you a lot about where people kind of reside, on this, because you can have means that are kind of close, but then the distribution tells you a lot about kind of the magnitude of the response, so to speak. Here is a plot showing the correlation between the ideal partner age, what people say they want, and their own age. So for women, very tight. This is an R of 0.91. Correlation, 0.91. You rarely see this in psychology, right? Pretty perfect correlation. For men, it's not as tight. The correlation is 0.76, or excuse me, 0.67. And what you also see, if you look at this chart, you see that as the age goes up, it gets a little bit more varied. So people are willing to have a larger gap when they get older, but particularly for men. You know, a lot of men, as they get older, their preference seems to stay pretty low. So again, this is different from what the OkCupid charts show that asked about what age is the woman most attractive. And that might be because if you ask what age is someone most attractive, or you rate a bunch of pictures, and you know, then you look at the picture ratings and you say, okay, which age of the pictures was related to the most attractive, you might, you know, find that a lot of people think women who are 20 are the most physically attractive. It's not the same as asking someone, what age do you really want? Because a lot of people, you know, might think, okay, you know, a woman who's 22 is very attractive, but I'm a 50-year-old man. I don't want to date a 22-year-old woman, you know. And some will, some, you know, they'll tell you, like I do. You know, you can see a dot here at the bottom. This was a 55-year-old man who said that he wanted to date a 10-year-old, you know. And maybe that's not a real response. Certainly, a lot of people found that amusing, so I left it on there. It could be a fake response, or it could be someone just being honest on the plot. You don't know. But certainly, you know, some of these others, you get, you know, some 55-year-old man or 56-year-old man or whatever the case may be, close to 60 there, who say, you know, he indicates a preference for someone who's 17 or 18. So you have men like that as they get older, they continue to want, as an ideal age gap in a relationship, women who are very young. With women, it doesn't seem to be the case. Women are very constrained in that sense by their own age. They want men who are close to their own age consistently as their own age increases. Another question that people asked, you know, who supports age gaps? Great. We know that men support them more on average now than women. But does this vary by age, you know? Because some of the discourse around this, especially given the fact that a lot of women dated someone who was really old, was kind of like, old women, I say old women, but older women, women who are more experienced, you know, 30 or above, are going to support age gaps less because they're going to have an experience in the past with an age gap that was bad. They will have learned from their mistakes. You know, and then you also have a hypothesis, an intersexual competition hypothesis, which is women who are older are going to approve of age gaps less because they represent competition, right? You know, you have a 30-year-old woman who's effectively competing with a 20-year-old woman for a man who is 30. So it's taking men out of that dating pool in a sense. And so that's the intersexual competition hypothesis for the age gap taboo. It has never been tested directly, as far as I know. I didn't set out to test that directly, so most of my questions are not aligned with that, but we can perhaps get an idea if that is true or not, or if at least this data is consistent with that or not by looking at support. We would expect, you know, women who are older to support age gaps less, but is that what the data shows? Well, you can see the NS in this, right? Not significant. You can see the distribution, very similar. Where the box plots are, where the violin distribution is. Women pretty much show the same amount of support or disapproval of age gaps regardless of their age. So there is no age effect for women on age gaps. If they view them negatively, positively, whatever the case may be, doesn't seem to change by age. For men, not the case. Men supported age gaps more when they were older men. And I say older men, but really what I did, I broke this down into age groups, mostly kind of testing young men versus old men. So 18 to 24, 25 to 31, and then 32 or above. So we're talking about men who are 32 years or older. They support age gaps more. Men who are between 18 and 31, there's no difference between those two groups, and they support age gaps less than men who are over 32 or 32 years and older. In fact, men within those age groups, if you can see on this chart, between about 18 and 31, they support age gaps about as much as women do on average across all of the female age groups. Now that could support an intersexual competition hypothesis, but for men, right? Because young men don't really benefit much from age gaps, right? If the desired female age, the best desired female age or whatever is, but in the 20s, let's say from 20 to 30, then why would men who are between 20 and 30 desire an age gap? They're going to desire women who are close to their own age. Who's going to desire an age gap more than, right? It's going to be men who, if they enter a relationship with that woman of a desired age, are going to have an age gap. And so is lower support for age gaps then from younger men an indication that they don't like age gaps? It wouldn't make sense if to have lower support only in the case that it wasn't relevant to them, so to speak, right? Because in that case, you would be completely neutral. But lower support would be consistent with viewing them more negatively relative to older men. You have young men saying, I don't really like age gaps. Perhaps that's because, they represent a threat to younger men in some case. And some people will say, maybe young men are more woke or whatever the case may be. Maybe young men are more aware of power imbalances. Maybe they're more liberal, but they weren't in my sample. Okay, so there was no political difference across the groups. But some people might say that. I'm always skeptical of ascribing like logical intentions to people when it comes to their beliefs and that, because certainly, as I mentioned at the beginning, a principle of psychology, pretty consistent across the whole discipline, is that people don't always know their own motivations. They don't always know what the hell's going on up here very much. So ascribing it to a motivated reasoning, something like that is a little bit more appealing. But of course, we can't know from sure from the data. But what do we do know from the data? The oldest men in this cohort support age gaps and hierarchical relationships more. As we see in this chart here, same pattern, hierarchical relationships, support from women, the same regardless of age group, older men supporting it more. Going on now, we can look at politics. So as I showed in the descriptive statistics, the distribution of politics for men and women, very similar. Here's a histogram of that for female overlaid on male. So we see that, the sample, just kind of understanding this, is not skewed left or right. We have a good sample of men and women who are equally representative of the left and the right. This chart here was the maximum actual age gap by politics. So I put in this slide the more support for an age gap. This doesn't measure support. This chart is about who had the largest age gaps. And we see a relationship where left-wing men were less likely to have a large age gap. Men who were centrist were a little bit more likely, and then conservative men and women both were more likely to have had a larger age gap at some point. Now, I say more likely, and you can see in this chart what looks like a clear trend. Something I should say right off, when I ran the statistics on this, it wasn't a statistically significant relationship. So this is an example of how a chart, you put the chart up, you don't run a statistical test. It can be very misleading because you might say, that's a clear pattern. I can see it with my own eyes. But, you run the tests, you run an ANOVA on it, and you see, well, we had 20 people in this group, and we had 20 people, and we had 30 people in this group, and you can't detect a significant difference in that. So is this relationship real? It could be, sometimes you want to look at the descriptive statistics, but it could just be error. It could be randomness. We don't actually know. So making that clear. In this slide, however, we do see a result that was statistically significant, okay? The more conservative the man was, the higher their desired age gap was. And we see the same pattern here that we did in the previous chart, although this is asking a different question. The last one was, what's your largest age gap? This one is, what is the age gap that you would desire? Left-wing men report an age gap of 3 years. They want a woman who is 3 years older on average. Men who are centrist, or a woman who is 3 years younger on average. Men who are centrist, right? They answered a 4, so middle of the scale. They reported wanting a woman who is 5 years younger on average. Men to the right of the scale reported wanting a woman who was 7.46 years younger on average. So men who are right-wing do express a stronger preference for a larger age gap. And this was a significant relationship for men. Because if you look at the descriptive statistics here, for women, it's the same. Okay? Left-wing, centrist, right-wing woman, they all want a man who is about 2 years older than them. Moving on now, I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking at some personality variables that I don't think anyone has ever looked at in relationship to age gaps before, okay? What are we looking at? I've described these already. Hostile world beliefs, SDO, DT, dark triad, right? And the three facets independently of the dark triad, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism. Right off the bat, there was no sex difference between men and women for SDO and for the hostile world beliefs. Not unexpected, you don't always see one. Men did score higher in the dark triad, statistically significant. Totally expected because that's something extremely consistent across research on the dark triad, right? Men score higher in this. Like most of the antisocial personality traits, men score higher on average. So, unexpected. Now, in my regression, the dark triad and social dominance orientation both predicted support for age gaps and for hierarchical relationships, right? So these antisocial personality traits did predict support for age gaps and for hierarchical relationships, but the relationships weren't large. This was the largest, social dominance orientation and hierarchical relationship support. You can see there, it's not a super tight line. This is a scale where you're gonna, visualizing a correlation when you have this kind of data set's sometimes misleading, but whatever. You have an R squared of 6.7. So we're talking about 6% of the variance in support for hierarchical relationships is explained by social dominance orientation. So it's not a lot. Moving on. But it's actually quite normal in psychology that if you look at just one variable like that, it's not going to explain a lot of the variance. Human behavior is very complex. It's multivariate, right? It's made up of many, many different things that contribute to something. And so that is, of course, entirely expected. I've mentioned in past videos, you see something statistically significant, good. So we know the relationship exists, but a small effect size. So it's not a huge relationship. So you couldn't conclude, from this result that if someone supports an age gap relationship, if someone supports a hierarchical relationship, that's going to be someone high in the dark triad. Not something you can know from this. So, knowing that behavior is complex and multivariate, I built a regression model using multiple variables, right? I did a multiple regression. I built 2 multiple regression models. I used stepwise regression to find the best fitting model. There wasn't any multicollinearity in the variables, so it worked pretty well. In these regression models, I was able to explain 24% of the variance in support for age gaps and 19% of the variance in support for hierarchical relationships. So that's not bad. That's pretty good in psychology if you can explain a quarter of the variance in something from your model. For age gaps, what explained it? What variables together? In the dark triad, psychopathy specifically, social dominance orientation, having low hostile world beliefs, so you don't see the world as a threatening place. Being male, obvious, as we kind of went over, and being older, again, obvious, we went over that already. And for hierarchical relationships, what about that? Again, psychopathy in the dark triad, SDO, social dominance orientation. Hostile world beliefs, again, low, male sex, and having had in the past a large age gap, and having a large ideal age gap. So what does that mean? You get someone who has kind of a cluster of these traits together, then you might see very high support. Alternately, since correlations are bidirectional, maybe you see someone who's really in support of these relationships, and maybe they're more likely to have a cluster of these traits as well. In the dark triad, as I mentioned, it was specifically the facet of psychopathy that predicted support. So something to consider because, the facets of the dark triad are correlated at about, between 0.3 and 0.5, but it was psychopathy specifically that predicted support for hierarchical and age gaps. I also asked participants what their ideal age gap was, okay? None of the variables in these models actually predicted an ideal age gap. So, again, two different questions, right? I'm giving these vignettes, showing people, do you support these relationships? And then I'm also asking people, what do you want in your own relationship? What is your ideal age gap? So when people see these relationships with large age gap, they score higher in psychopathy and social dominance orientation, they're more likely to say they support it. But people who want a large or a small age gap aren't actually more likely to score high in these antisocial personality traits. So we have kind of mixed evidence. There's people that say men who want large age gaps are manipulators. They want to take advantage of a young woman, which could be supported by the support scores and the relationship. And then at the same time, people that score high in these things don't actually report wanting a larger age gap either. So maybe not. So we would expect, if a feature of these relationships is manipulation and coercion and that sort of a thing, for people who form these relationships to score higher in those traits, right? But neither for men nor for women did any of these traits predict having a larger age gap. So maybe the people who score higher in these traits and approve of these relationships aren't forming them for whatever reason. Maybe the people who are forming them are actually quite normal. I also looked at differences in opinion by people who had these relationships and people who have not. Remember, we went over some of the research in the beginning that indicated students dating their professors were pretty happy with those relationships, funny enough. People in these relationships were more supportive of them than people kind of observing, and that's kind of what we see here as well, right? So support for hierarchical relationships and for age gap relationships were higher when people had a past age gap relationship, right? People with the larger age gaps seem to view age gaps less negatively. And we also see a sex difference. Even though people view these less negatively, both men and women, the magnitude with which they view these relationships more or less positively is not the same for men and women. This is kind of where the violin plots really do a good work, because you can see that men who had past large age gaps, 10 years or more, were extremely supportive of age gaps in general, right? Look at the support scores. They all cluster up there at the top. Women, although they also indicated higher support on average, were more distributed in their scores, okay? You see that. There's more mixed feelings among women. So part of the age gap discourse that I have seen is some people say, a lot of, when I showed the charts to people and they saw that a lot of women had been in an age gap, yet most women also report wanting a tiny age gap. They said, okay, most women have had negative experiences with an age gap and they've learned from it. This could provide a little bit of support for that at least some of the women, not all of them, but at least some of the women, that had a past age gap also ended up viewing them pretty negatively. Here are sex differences, okay, between men, these are within sex differences. Within sex differences for men, within sex differences for women, for those who had age gaps, men with age gaps versus men without age gaps, women with age gaps versus women without age gaps. So, men who had age gaps, more supportive of age gaps than men who did not, okay? You could, again, interpret that as kind of an intersexual competition thing. You could interpret that as simple self-interest or, experience of the age gap versus not experience, whatever. The same pattern for women, okay? Women who had age gap relationships were more supportive of age gap relationships than women who had never had a large age gap before. Here is some general finding about the magnitude of the age gap. This is based on the scenarios that I presented where participants would rate them, okay? Because I presented scenarios with different age gaps, 5-year age gap, 10-year age gap, 15 and 20. as you would expect, okay, the larger the age gap, the less support. Very typical. A result probably that you would expect. The maximum score possible in this chart is a 7. So the mean support for a 5-year age gap was about a 7. Almost no one had a problem with a 5-year age gap. The mean support for a 10-year age gap was a 6. So already, the vast majority of people supported a 10-year age gap, which is already pretty large. So this is interesting because it indicates also that, well, actually it's pretty consistent, with what I mentioned in the beginning in those papers as well, that you have about 30% of the people, the box here shows the interquartile range. You have about 30% of people who view them negatively, and you have the remaining 70% that view them neutral or positively. Kind of what we see here, at least up to a 10-year age gap. You get into 15-year age gap territory, you get into 20-year age gap territory, and that's when people start to give it, the side eye. It's when they start to say, okay, that's a little weird. So there is a question, and I mentioned this as well. Is it about the magnitude of the gap, or is it about the age of the woman? Because if you have a larger age gap, you also tend to have a younger woman. Not always, but that's kind of the way that it goes. So this is support based on the age of the woman in the age gap scenarios. When the woman is 20, support is pretty low, okay? The mean is about a 4. Most of the people are rating this age gap, and these are across different size age gaps, but this is just by the age of the woman. When the woman's age increases to 25, then you start seeing most people support an age gap regardless of the gap. At 30, age 35 for a woman, no one cares, regardless of the size of the gap. So age gap taboos are not really just about the size of the gap. Size of the gap almost, doesn't matter in a sense. What matters is the size of the gap in conjunction with the age of the woman, specifically when the woman is young, specifically when the woman is younger than 25 years old, which is certainly consistent with a lot of that age gap discourse, right? You see Leonardo DiCaprio dating the 19-year-old, and you see people saying pedophile, and that's someone that falls, within that range here, like you see in the chart of, 18 to 25. By about 25, the size of the age gap, people are going to not care as much regardless. So effective age, the effect of the woman's age. And here is a chart looking at differences in support for types of hierarchical relationships. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning of this video was that a lot of discourse around these is a power imbalance discourse, right? They say these relationships are bad because there is a power imbalance, they're inherently exploitative. So I set up some common scenarios that look like normal, normal hierarchical relationships. We have a student dating a professor, and I wrote this based on the research that I had read previously. I said, this is a 26-year-old graduate student dating a 35-year-old junior professor. So it's not like an 18-year-old dating a 60-year-old dean of the school or whatever. This is kind of typical of what those relationships might look like. Boss and employee, and specifically I said the manager of a McDonald's is dating an employee that works at the drive-thru. I said a movie star and a model, and I said a president and his wife. So it's difficult to quantify in which of these scenarios has the real largest power imbalance. That's kind of a matter of opinion, but I'll tell you mine, okay? I think the largest power imbalance in the scenarios that I created for this study were the boss and the employee. Why? Because the manager at a McDonald's has direct power over the employee. Okay. Also, these are low-wage workers, and it's in a business with no worker protection, a McDonald's. So I think that's where, a boss could easily say to an employee, like, yeah, you're going to do sexual favors or whatever, and if not, you're fired. Movie star and model, I think, probably has the lowest institutional power imbalance, so to speak. Why? They're not even related. They're not even, in fact, the only hierarchical element in that scenario that I included in that was age, right? It was that one was older than the other, right? That the movie star and I mean, that's supposed to be based on like Leo and whatever, because a lot of discourse. And then president and wife, right? So that's something I based on a lot of presidents that we see around the world, right? You have a president who's maybe 20 years older than his wife. Probably there's a lot of power imbalance in a relationship like that. And certainly that's kind of one of the things I think some feminist authors have mentioned and discussed a little bit, is that you can have a relationship where it's a hierarchical relationship, but it's not institutional in a sense, where it's not like he's the employer of his wife, but at the same time he probably wields an amount of power that is extreme in many ways. So given that all of these relationships don't necessarily have the same power imbalance, why is it that some are approved of much less than others? Okay, the student and the professor relationship, and I just said this is a graduate student dating a junior professor. Didn't even say that they were in the same field or in the same lab or whatever. They might not even be working together. Why does that have the same approval as a boss and an employee when there is much more of a power dynamic there? If power dynamics really explain the difference, I would expect lower support for the boss and the employee. And I would expect higher support for the movie star and the model as well. And yet, that was the one that got the lowest support. And I would probably expect a little bit lower support also for the president and the wife. Anyway, this is one of the things that makes me think that the power imbalance discourse is probably not the real reason for the taboo. And we can go on now to the final thoughts and go over some of these results and what they might say. First, did we see the stated versus the revealed preferences? Kind of, right? At least for women. We saw that a lot of women have at least dated at some point a man who is a lot older, even though they prefer men who are very close to their own age. Is that really a preference? Because a preference would say that they want this more than the option, or is it a concession, right? Or is it a compromise? Is it something that they settled for? That's a question in a lot of this reported versus revealed preferences discourse. What it probably does, so, I would hesitate to interpret that as, like women really want someone who is older, and because that's what they do. But what I think it does show is that probably a lot of women are willing to compromise on it at least once, even if it is not ideal. Do we see evidence for the intersexual competition hypothesis for age gap taboos? Maybe, but just for men, right? Because there was no age difference for support by women, but there was for men, right? Old men supported the age gaps, right? I say old, but it was men, 32 and above. So older men supported the age gaps, younger men didn't. Could that be driven by the fact that age gaps are less beneficial for younger men? Maybe. It's consistent, but it's not like proof or anything. So do power dynamics drive disapproval? Well, as mentioned in the last slide, this is a narrative that I'm very, very skeptical of. And I think in part, I wanted to test it. I don't think that the scenarios used really reflected that power dynamics are driving the taboo. And I'm also skeptical of this because it seems very much like a rationalization that people would come up way downstream of that visceral feeling, right? That visceral feeling that the age gap is gross. And there's a lot of reasons why people might have that feeling that are not based on like a postmodern feminist analysis of class and power. That's a very complex, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right. Don't do that really much in my videos. I'm saying it's probably not the real motive behind the taboo. Also, do we see, importantly, kind of the main thing being tested here, are age gaps actually associated with antisocial personality? Well, perhaps some mixed results on that. We did see that the antisocial personality traits, dark triad psychopathy, and social dominance orientation predicted support for age gap relationships, but they didn't predict who actually had age gap relationships. And they didn't predict who wanted an age gap either, who wanted a bigger or a smaller age gap. So what could that mean? Well, it's possible that people actually forming age gap relationships And the people who are like, yeah, I really want a big age gap relationship, because they have an antisocial personality and they do think that would be exploitative and they like it. Maybe, that's why they support the age gaps, but they're not forming them nonetheless. Maybe they can't, because certainly having antisocial personality traits doesn't usually help with relationship formation. Meanwhile, perhaps it's people who are a little bit more psychologically balanced, so to speak, who are forming the relationships, and they're probably pretty agreeable, and they're probably forming these relationships, falling in love, and maybe it's not even like ideal, but they kick it off with someone and oh well, there's a big age gap, so it's whatever. I think that could explain perhaps why we see support for the age gaps, and why at the same time it doesn't predict actual formation of age gap relationships. So the final question, and this data maybe can address some of it: what really drives the age gap taboo? And if you ask me, I would, opinion time here. It's like many taboos. It's a visceral feeling, an ick, a gross. People see the age gap, particularly they see, and it's not the gap, as I mentioned. It's not just a gap. It's an age gap when the woman is especially young. They see that and they think gross. Why might that be? Well, for one, a lot of women might have had an experience as a young woman being hit on by old men that they find gross, okay? If you're a 40-year-old man, unfortunately, for most of us, 40-year-old man is not the most attractive man. 28-year-old man, okay. 30-year-old man, many still look good. 25-year-old man, probably in his prime. But it is the case, that a lot of young women have experienced an old man hitting on them that's gross. And so maybe when they think of an age gap relationship, that is what is going on in their mind. They're not thinking of, like a 40-year-old silver fox fitness model in that case. That's not the mental image that comes to mind, because that's not typical. They're thinking of like gross old guy, sugar daddy paying young women and that sort of thing. The guy who lied about his age on Tinder. I set my Tinder range to, 18 to 25 and I'm swiping and oh, who's this 40-year-old guy? Gross. I think that might drive some of it. But even more than that, a lot of taboos may be rooted in our evolutionary history in a way that we feel aversion to things without knowing why. Okay? These are aversions that we felt long before we understood even why a taboo might emerge in an evolutionary sense. And I don't think we know well why this age gap taboo exists, but I would also hesitate to just dismiss it out of hand. And this is something people do with these debates around sex and that sort of thing. When you have a sexual taboo, when you have a lot of aversion toward a sexual behavior, you'll have people be like, why? Explain it. Is it rational? And a lot of these, relationship and taboos, if they're a feeling that people have, they're not going to be easily explained in a rational sense, because our, logic on paper doesn't dictate how we feel about certain things like this. And at the same time, we shouldn't expect it to, because this is something people get wrong about decision-making, the decision-making process, judgment and decision-making, the way the mind works. That if a belief is formed emotionally, if a belief is formed based on heuristics, right? Because it's similar to saying emotionally in that case. I put a image of a book by psychologist Gerd Gigerenze at the beginning that talks about, why gut feelings, trusting your gut feelings, why that makes you smart. It's true. These predict things, okay? And they do it pretty well. We've evolved heuristics to sense danger, to sense things that are off, that are not right. And part of the way that we sense and feel that is through taboos. We see something, we think, ooh, gross. And maybe we don't know why it's gross. No one knew about germ theory until relatively recently, but people have known, like, don't eat rotten food for a really, really long time, long enough that people have evolved a visceral reaction to rotten food, like, ooh, gross. And the same with something like a fear of snakes, right? We know that a snake, boom, can bite you and all of that. People didn't know how poison worked, or venom, I should say, long ago, but people learned. They kind of learned, like, an association, like, with this thing and that thing. Certain sexual taboos may be like that, and don't want to, like, stigmatize any, because, there's many sexual taboos as well that develop that may be cultural, that maybe are not rooted in like a good reason, so to speak. And perhaps age gaps are that way as well. But whatever the case may be, I think this is really what drives the age gap taboo. I think it's a sort of heuristic. It's probably very complex and driven by a lot of different perceptions, both conscious and unconscious, that makes certain people, about that 30% of the population, when they see an age gap, they think, ooh, gross. And it's probably driven in some point by self-interest as well, right? Men are more supportive than women. Why? Well, men probably aren't getting hit on a lot by gross old women. Young women are. And at the same time, we see older men support it more, age gaps, than younger men. Why? Well, old men might benefit more from these as well. So, all things to think about. Some questions perhaps answered, many questions unanswered. Maybe we will never know. In any case, thank you for watching the video, and I'll talk to you guys very soon.